Good. We are recording. Hi. Oh, it's nice to see some new faces. Thanks so much for being here. We love these industry calls. We love you sharing knowledge. And today we have a stellar lineup of powerful women who are going to help us with a conversation around board governance. Before we dive in, just a few housekeeping membership things. So just a reminder to submit your events in your member portal. If you're not connected yet, you can reach out to Robin. She's on the screen here. She'll wave and say hello. And you can reach out to her and sure. Sorry, it's just members contacting. Robin, can you share the link to the industry call with Callie, please, from Capital Pride? She just sent me a note. Thank you. Yes, so if you don't have your events up yet in your member portal, please reach out to Robin and she can walk you through how to get those up there. We get a lot of traction on our website, so it's really worth the effort to get your events up on our calendar. Some really great news that came out of Factor funding. For those of you who present live music in your programming, there's a new fund with Factor to help you present Canadian artists in any live music capacity that you have in your programming. So you can go to factor.ca and learn more about that, or contact us and we will connect you. We have our summit coming up on November 25th. It's going to be at the RA Center, and this year is going to be a full day. And we're going to have programming and conversation and some workshops and panels and some great food and a trade show as well. So you can get to know the suppliers that we have in this area for our festivals. So that's just some of the things that we have going on coming up. And so today we're going to dive into a really important topic. And I have conversations with our members a lot about just board governance, and it's very common in the not-for-profit world and all worlds really, but we just see it more pronounced in our not-for-profit worlds, that governance and in high transient environments, it can be difficult to keep some momentum with good governance with our boards and the relationship between staff and boards. So we have pulled together the dream team for today. We have Catherine Cosgrove with us, who's an expert in board governance 101. I'll let her tell you more about herself when she takes over. And we have Deborah Rosati, who does, she's going to be talking about the critical role of representation, and she runs an organization called Women on Board. And Sam Laprade, who a lot of you may know from here in Ottawa, she specializes in recruitment and talent recruitment, and she'll be joining us as well for today's talk. And so to get us started, I'd like to turn it over to Catherine Cosgrove to talk about Board Governance 101. Welcome, Catherine. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much. It's so nice to see everybody. I appreciate the invitation to join you today. My name is Catherine Cosgrove, as you said. I will just give you the 2-minute version of who I am but I invite you also to jump in and take some questions. I don't see too many cameras on, but I can hear you, I hope. But please feel free to jump in at any point. But my background is as a consultant. And so I was a strategy consultant for a big firm in Canada for a long time, and later became a governance consultant in the same firm and responsible for that firm's own governance model, which was a partnership. So it was Deloitte. Which some of you may be familiar with, maybe be audited by or had consulting services by. But the experience in governance at the partnership, in a partnership environment, was an interesting one. But I'd already worked with nonprofits. And what I really wanted to do after that experience was apply all of the background that I had as a consultant and that kind of unique expertise in governance, and really continue to serve organizations and governments and private companies even, and other partnership environments like engineering firms and different organizations, but focus on governance. So I opened my own consulting practice a few years ago. And the short story is I got a lot of calls, which was great, but a lot of odd calls, strange calls during the pandemic in particular, when nonprofits in particular found that there were situations that they weren't prepared to handle. And I'm sure you all have the horror stories of having to navigate setting up Zoom calls for the first time, and boards that weren't online, and boards that couldn't meet, and some of those odd things that happened during that time. And I really developed an interest and a real passion for supporting community-based nonprofit organizations. I think that volunteers really are the unsung heroes of a lot of organizations. And while my interest is in governance, I'm really sort of personally passionate about supporting organizations who rely on the energy and the time of volunteers. And then someone like myself comes in later when something goes wrong and has to write a report and criticize. And I'd never wanted to be in that situation. And then unfortunately, I was in the work that I did as a consultant. So I developed a program called Board Leapfrog, which is sort of an open registration, free for all for organizations that are a lot in the health and social services sectors, but other sectors as well. And I run that program periodically. I live in Nova Scotia, but I'm in Ontario a lot. I run that, pardon me, wherever I am, and I customize the program for organizations. But this is really a little bit of what I've found in the Board Leapfrog program and as a consultant that has been useful and kind of the gaps that I see in a lot of organizations. And I think, boy, if folks knew that, maybe these, bad things wouldn't have happened. So in conversation with Tara prior to this call, we thought that I might focus on those kind of areas, the special cases or the special sort of attention areas and just zoom in. I had to laugh when I saw the agenda and I thought board governance 101, 20 minutes. What am I going to say for 20 minutes? There's a lot to cover, but I will do my best to jump through what is kind of the most critical, I think. Again, happy to take your questions all the way through, but I'm going to focus on a couple of key areas that I hope might be relevant to you. The tagline for Board Leapfrog, by the way, is turning your passion into brilliant board leadership, because for me, that's the key. Organizations that rely on the volunteers are almost always there because they love the organization. They love what it does, the activities, the sector, the children it serves, the people that it serves. Nobody's there because they love governance. Except me, because I actually love governance and I'm a bona fide governance nerd. So you may have to get the hook. I'll try and stay within my 20 minutes. So a couple of things today. What I'm going to talk about is trying and I'm sure half of you will probably, or more than half of you already know this stuff. So I like to put it out there and you can choose to ignore what isn't relevant or what you already knew, and maybe I'll share some thoughts that might be useful. So I'll talk about the board's role and accountabilities and just clarifying that. I'm going to talk about those special focus areas, like in general, but how do you aim for good governance when you have kind of unusual situations like, no paid staff or paid staff are limited? You have directors that play multiple roles, like you have a board member who's also a key volunteer in the organization. When you have skill sets that are hard to find, and I'm thinking particularly around, like financial oversight or legal oversight, that can be a real challenge for boards. I think Deborah's going to talk about board composition, or somebody's going to be talking about recruiting. Maybe it's Sam. And I think that'll nicely focus on. So I won't spend too much time talking about those things, but I think it's quite related. And often in organizations, when the process or the kind of mechanics of governance takes a real backseat to day-to-day realities. I mean, we all have an organization to run, an event to put on, and sometimes the work of that takes over and the governance is in the back seat. So given that sort of scenario, how do you manage those realities? Like, what is a better way, even given the reality? And what would you sort of really need to get right as an organization? I try to be really practical and focus on what would I say are the top priorities. There will always be, in a governance journey, in evolution, there's always stuff to do. But if you had to pick 3 or 4 things, what would those be on my short list? And I'd love to hear your thoughts if you agree, if you don't agree. So that's what I'll talk about today. Nonprofit community, just to set the tone a little bit, I think we have, well, at one point we had 130,000 nonprofits across the country. I'm sure there's more than that. In Ontario, you have 60,000. Of those, 30,000 plus are registered charities, which is a unique situation. Some of your members may be charities as well as nonprofits. You don't have to be. You can choose to do that, but it comes with special obligations. Those organizations in Ontario are responsible for a huge amount of revenue, a huge amount of employees, and a number of volunteer hours. And when I look at these numbers, I think, given the given the number of employees and the number of volunteers, you can see that there's an awful lot more volunteers than probably involved than paid staff. And so it really is in this overall nonprofit sector, of which festivals and fairs are a significant component. What I find really interesting about the nonprofit sector is that there's huge diversity. You have organizations that have, 500 employees and a huge reliance on volunteers, and some that have zero employees or one employee or a zero point 0.5 ED or something of that nature. You have organizations that have huge budgets and some that are just on a shoestring. You've got staff, you've got a well-run, well-organized, well-managed, and you've got organizations that are really struggling. You also have boards that have a different model. You have boards that are what I would call truly governing boards, and they're really in an oversight role, versus those that are actually running the organization. I had a client one time that was a 45-year nonprofit, and the original board had been running it the whole time. And the very sort of key to bringing in the first paid staff was that the 85-year-old lady who ran the bakery couldn't do it anymore. And, it was the first time this organization ever had to say, well, in order to bake the bread that we sell to raise money for whatever we're raising, we need to think of different options, but they were really at a crisis point. So the difference between governing boards and operating boards are there's a day-to-day difference. But I think the point that I'd like to make here is that every nonprofit organization and charity must, by law, have a board of directors. That's how you get registered. If you're a registered organization, and most are, that would be in your sector. So everybody's got a board of directors. On average, I'd say boards can be huge in some sectors, but 10 directors, 12 directors, sometimes less, sometimes more. So that's an awful lot of people that are involved in the oversight of the organization and the achievement of its missions. What's really interesting, and I think what I've found has been a real eye-opener for some folks, has been that while every organization is different, they're big, they're small, they've got staff, they don't have staff, the board and its directors actually have the same obligations. And so the challenge is when you have a tiny, struggling operating board, or a tiny board that's a well-run organization, your obligations as a director are no different than if you were sitting in a big office with a huge staff and a big budget. And so it's really important for board members, particularly if they're on the small or on the underfunded or on the struggling end, it's really important for board members to know what their obligations are. Because one way or another, the business of the day, the activities of the day will take over, but you're still accountable. And that's the part that I think, again, is sometimes lost, and that I just wanted to emphasize here. So 3 duties. These are, if you've had any governance training, of which I'm sure many of you have, these 3 duties are shared by all directors, and that would include outside of nonprofits as well. Those would be public companies on the Toronto Stock Exchange, and those would be private companies. But there's a duty of loyalty, there's a duty of care, and there's a duty of obedience. Those, I won't go into too much detail in the interest of time, but those are 3 duties that all directors have. And it really means that you have to act in the best interests of the organization overall. So even if you're on a board of another organization and there's some relationship, when you've got your board hat on, for that organization, you have to act in the interests of that organization. And that can be really hard to do because we're all human. But trying to keep the lens and know what hat you're wearing at any given time can be very useful. I literally do that and imagine that I'm putting on a hat and changing hats, because that can be a really useful technique. A duty of care means you show up and you're participating in governance. You come prepared, that you inquire if things don't make sense. You have a concern, you raise it, but not a passive recipient of information, and you're just kind of, don't show up to meetings and that sort of thing. You have an obligation to participate in the governance if you are sitting as a director in an organization. And when I say director, I'm going to make a distinction between a director. A lot of people use the word board members, and sometimes there's no difference, but members of an organization are different. And so I always use the word director just to be clear that I'm talking about the people who are on the board, elected to the board. And the duty of obedience is a big one as well, which is, I think people are trying to change the word obedience to something else, but it really means that the organization, that you as a director are responsible for ensuring that the organization is meeting its obligations. It's following the rule book, whatever the rule book is, and I'll talk about that in a second. But whatever is set out for this organization of which you are a director, and it says it's going to do A, B, and C, and its bylaws have a rule book that you have to follow, you really need to make sure that that's happening. The bylaws are pretty important. I'll talk about those in a minute. What this speaks to is a cascade of documents. This is another part that I found to be I like diagrams. I'm a consultant. A lot of people don't like diagrams, but I find it useful to think about that everything that happens in an organization has to have legitimacy somewhere. So every organization, the nonprofit organization, or even a private company, has to be created through legislation. So there's an act. You have a nonprofit act. ONCA is the nonprofit act in Ontario, but some organizations could be created by a special act of the province, by some mechanism through a municipality. There's special agencies. There's all kinds of different legislation mechanisms that you can be created as an organization. And it's very important as a director for you to know which one, because they have slightly different rules or slightly different obligations. So the legislation is kind of at the top of the heap here, the peak. And that legislation gives legitimacy to an organization that's registered. So when you hear words like incorporating documents or constating documents is another way to refer to it, it means the articles of association or the memorandum of association. And it's like the registration form where this organization, when it was created, it said it's going to do certain things. And it's usually a very short list. It's like 3 things, 4 things sometimes. And that's what you call your objects as an organization, or your purposes as an organization. And you have to stay within those. So if you're delivering a festival and you want to go open a bakery, that's probably not in your objects. You could maybe find a way, but there's staying within the lane of what your organization was supposed to do is really important. Those incorporation documents, part of what you do when you register a new organization is you have bylaws, and they're created at the time when an organization is created, and they can be updated and changed. And by the way, they should be. You should reflect on them and think about them as you go along. But those bylaws really speak to how the organization was run. The incorporating documents just says this is the organization and what it stands for, but it doesn't say anything about the board and who's on the board and who the members are. That's all laid out in the bylaws. And then you have a range of policy and procedure, and you've got forms and checklists and all kinds of procedural documents, but they all have to flow ideally, I guess they should flow in this cascade. They have to make sense and hook on to the thing that comes above. So you couldn't have something in a policy procedure that was contradicted in your bylaws. It has to align with the thing that's above it. What's important is that the detail goes, that there's greater detail as you move on. But you really need to know as a board member what exists in the organization, and that it all makes sense together as one overall system of governance. I talked a little bit about the bylaws, and that's really about the rule book for how the organization operates internally. It amazes me, and I guess it doesn't amaze me, but I can't help but reflect how many times I've done a review or worked with organizations who know that the bylaws are really out of date, or say things like, yeah, we don't do it anyway. That's the way the board has been elected, but we don't do that. Or we don't know who our members are. I had an organization one time that didn't know how to give, and the bylaws just said the members had to be notified of the AGM, and the members were whoever the board said they were going to be. Well, that's not very helpful. If that gets lost in time from 30 years ago when an organization was created to now, that puts the board, the current board, in a real spot about who are we obligated to give notice to if we don't have a list. And so sometimes the bylaws say you have to have a list, or the act says you have to have a list. But the bylaws are in Ontario, you do have kind of a standard template, which is very useful. They can be slightly different between organizations. Again, if you have a different mechanism, like if your organization was created by a special act. I'm trying to think of an example in your sector. The Toronto exhibition, I believe, was created by a special act. There's a couple of others. Agricultural fairs are often created by a special act through the agricultural legislation, not through ONCA. So you have to know which one, and then what are the obligations under that. And it sounds like gobbledygook, but it's actually it's just useful to make it all make sense. Why do we do certain things? You can go, oh, that's why. The answer is always in the bylaws or in the act. But the bylaws, particularly if you have paid staff like an executive director, that person tends to be the person who knows the bylaws inside and out. And I would strongly encourage you, if you are an executive director, spend some time, have a little glass of wine, put your feet up, and make sure you're clear on what's in the bylaws. Because if anything ever happened later, you have to know that you followed your bylaws, because there's things in there like, who the directors are and how they get elected, who the members are. There are people who buy registration or buy tickets, or they're people that have been designated in a certain community, or you got to know because you've got obligations to them. It often also says what the board's powers are. So the board has a right to update its bylaws, or to call a meeting, or that it has the right to hire an ED. There's often things like that. And so it's important to know. But what happens if the bylaws aren't clear? There was a style of bylaw creation a long time ago, like 30 years ago, where I think I mentioned the example of not being clear about who the board, the members are whoever the board said they're going to be. Well, I think the lawyer who wrote them might have thought that was useful, but it really puts people in a bind. So maybe I can just ask you, what happens if the bylaws aren't clear? What would you do if you were with an organization and the bylaws weren't clear? I know most people don't. Most people don't have a good answer for that. I don't really have a good answer for that. Oh, go ahead, Mary. Did you want to say something? Oh, I thought you waved your hand. No. Oh, you're on mute, Marion. Oh, Marion's on mute. Sorry. Oh, maybe everybody's muted. I don't know. I don't know if I can unmute you. Ask to unmute. Oh, we'll come back to you, Marion. I'd love to get people involved. Oh,
Yeah,
go ahead.
no, that worked. Whatever you did worked.
Oh
You. We just actually had this. Our AGM was last night. We amended a bylaw. So
yeah, great.
we originally did it at the board as a board at the board meeting, and then
Hmm.
it passed, and we brought it to the membership where
That's
it
right.
was carried. So it was
For you.
not a difficult process. It wasn't a difficult bylaw, but nevertheless, so you can amend quite easily a
That's
bylaw that doesn't suit you anymore.
hmm Yep, great answer. Thank you. That's exactly the right way I would approach it too. Sometimes the bylaws are tricky. The bylaws sometimes outline if you have different classes of members. You have members that have voting rights, or members that don't, or members that have different. You need to have certain group approve something if you're going to make a change. Members can be quite different, or they can be hard to find and hard to get a quorum. The other thing to know as well about bylaw changes that you just reminded me of is that the board generally can approve an update and operate under the new bylaws, but they have to be presented and ratified by the members at the next AGM. If you don't go to the very next AGM with the changed bylaws, then they go away. You're back to the old system. And that's the big danger that a lot of organizations don't know or don't realize. They have to come back to the members and put them in the AGM package, even if it was January last year that it happened and the next AGM is coming up. So So that was a great tip. They can be amended. They can be complicated. Sometimes you have to socialize and consult with members depending on the size of the organization, and sometimes you get pushback, and it's not as easy. But definitely worth doing. It can be very helpful to clarify that. And make sure that the bylaws are as clear as they need to be, because they can be quite useful to you when you're trying to get things done. They can also be a pain in the neck, but that being said, so any board that has any organization that has a board, particularly, and I would say that is most in focus for a governing board, but that would be the same job for any board, including operating boards. And this is the part that kind of gets missed sometimes. That any nonprofit board has three kind of purposes of having a board. Why do we even have a board in the first place? It's to set the mission, or to kind of establish, carry out the mission, and make sure that things are being done in the way that they need to be done. It's to ensure the organization has the right resources. So that means both staff, and that the person who's leading the organization on a day-to-day basis, if they have a paid ED, but they have people that are going to run it, that the board is competent and the board has the skills and everything that it needs, that the finances are there. We that's a tricky one, because if an organization is struggling financially, sometimes the board, looks to the ED and says, what are you doing about it? Or sometimes the ED looks to the board and says, I need your help, and nobody's answering the phone. There's different ways of approaching it, but the board really has accountability for making sure the organization has funds. I wouldn't recommend everybody write a check. That's not what I'm talking about, but like helping with proposals, helping with grants, helping with contacts for fundraising, whatever the case may be. There's different ways to do it, but making sure that that's in place. And then also enhancing the organization's trust and reputation. The board has a real role to play in that, and accountability for that. The oversight and accountability as well is about overseeing that things are being done. The difference between the doing and the overseeing can be quite difficult. It can be difficult when you're in the moment to tease it out. I would encourage you to think about your governing documents and your bylaws, and find out where those accountabilities are, and what does it say in writing that you're accountable for as a board. But that's generally the case. You got to achieve the mission, act within the purposes, comply with your obligations. That would include your obligations to members in the law, in your funding and licensing agreements. There's often obligations. The organization must submit an annual report to the funder by this date. The board's got to make sure that happens. In a contract, what was it that you were signing up to do as part of this contract? You got to make sure that happens. The board doesn't necessarily have to do it, but the board needs to make sure it has happened. So those are the key takeaways for me. It often changes the conversation, and it changes. And I would encourage you, people who sit on boards, or people who work with volunteers who sit on boards who are in the doing as well, to think about it as a shift in mindset, from you're doing the work, you're volunteering, you're hanging lights, you're selling tickets, whatever the case may be, doing the marketing, to overseeing that it gets done. And you are in an awkward spot if you're playing two roles, because you've got the hat on of the doing, and then as a board member, you got to take the hat off and say, is everything being done properly? Well, of course it is, because I just did the ticket sales or the fundraising or whatever it was. So you have to have that sort of awareness that you are in an awkward spot, but that's the reality. The questions on the right, though, are some examples of what you would ask as a board member that you probably wouldn't ask as a doer. So things like, why are we seeing this overall financial result? What policies do we have in place to guide our decision? Sometimes, when you're doing, you just do. What does our agreement say about that topic? So those are questions that boards should be asking, and you as a director to ask. There's different ways to think about your oversight role. I'll share these slides with you. You can use them later. I know I'm running out of time. I told you you'd have to get the hook, Tara.
No problem. You got 5 more minutes.
Okay, great. There's looking in the rearview mirror, what we call hindsight. So the financial results that are presented to you are about the past. You can't change what money was spent or not spent. It's why it happened, why did it happen? The insight is what's going to happen, what are we going to do about it, kind of thing. The foresight is what do we want to make happen? How can we make this happen? We want to grow. We want to get out of the weeds as a board. And that foresight is really where I encourage boards to try and get to, even if they're running the organization and directly involved in the operations. It can be very useful to think about, are we spending enough time on foresight or even insight? Or is everything we're doing really in hindsight? And that is a nice way. You can even look at your agendas and you can say, are we spending any time on foresight at this meeting? No, let's put half an hour on the agenda and talk about what do we want to have happen? Okay, we've just got through this year's event. Next year's event, what would we like to see that's different? And then you work backwards. So that foresight can be really useful. Commonly called noses in, fingers out for governing boards. And I don't think that's a reality for a lot of organizations. And so, that is something to be aware of, again, but not necessarily the reality. So what happens when you are on a governing board or supporting a governing board? How can you find a bit more balance between you and carrying out your role as a director and as a board when you're actually doing the doing as well? It's not easy, but there's a couple of things you can do to create the space for the board to keep its governing hat really firmly on, at least for a short time. Recognizing that the day-to-day activities, the event planning, the event, logistics are going to take over, but making sure the first item on the left is when you meet as a board, take the time on your agenda to meet as a board. The event or whatever the case is that's going to happen, that you can have that conversation in a little bit, but spend your time, maybe an hour every time you meet as a board, and make sure it's truly governing board business that you're covering. So do you take any time to discuss your legal framework? When was the last time we reviewed our bylaws is a great example. Or what legislation are we under and what does that change? Strategic matters and how you're progressing on the overall, like, do you have a strategic plan? Is it out of date? Have you made progress? Are you talking about those things as a board, as opposed to the kind of what I'd call the tactics or the day-to-day stuff? What are our stakeholders doing? Oh, there's a new federal program, or oh, this is going to affect us. And all of that stuff is very interesting. As an organization, does that change things for you? That's the conversation. Whether your particular program gets funded, that's always interesting. But it's like, as an organization, what's the big picture? Really important to spend time on compliance and risk matters. So, for example, have you filed your tax returns? Have you filed your other obligations, through CRA, if you're a registered charity? Are we following what we said we were going to do? Have we had any whistleblower complaints? Are there areas where we really should be paying more attention? And as a board, that's our job. We have to look at the risks and have a very high, I'd say high tolerance for risk as well. Not high tolerance for risk, high tolerance for discussing risk is what I meant to say. It can be uncomfortable. Some people feel that when you talk about risk, you're personally criticizing them. And I would say, to the degree that you can get away from that, don't. It's not a personal criticism. It's just a kind of adult conversation about the risks facing our organization. And you have to talk about your financial matters in the big picture, the organization's financial matters. Do you have your financial statements? Are they up to date? If not, why? You have to get them done. That's your obligation as a board. If you need to hire a separate bookkeeper or somebody to get them done, great. Find a way to do that, because as a board, there are certain obligations that are financial obligations that I would strongly encourage you to make sure are compliant. Your payroll deductions, for example, you don't want to drive by those. That's a real area of risk. You can add questions to frame the board part of the discussion that might be useful to keep the attention on those governing level things, adding questions to the agenda, putting an agenda topic that's a truly strategic topic. And then the rest of the stuff that you're going to deal with anyway, you're going to get to. The second is to make your volunteer role distinct from your board role. So, for example, if you're a director and you've got a real role to play in an event or in a festival or in the workings of the organization, make sure that everybody's clear. That's your personal capacity. You're not there because you're a board member. You're there because you are a dedicated volunteer or because you have special expertise. And where possible, I really encourage organizations to try not to put board members in a leadership role in an as a volunteer. That's really a little bit too far, I find, with overseeing their own effectiveness as a leader. And so if you can drive the truck or hang the lights or do something, but not lead teams of people, that can be really useful. So try and be as kind of focused in your volunteer time as possible, and make sure that anybody that you're working with as a director, the staff, the other volunteers, that they're clear. Are you giving direction from the board? Hopefully not. You're just there as Catherine or as Lisa or as Tara, and that how communication will flow to and from the board. Just being clear about that, that can be really useful. The last thing I'd say is considering changes. If you can be a board member or a volunteer, I mean, you're a volunteer as a board member, but if you can volunteer for an organization in the operations or be a board member, to try and to separate that. We're finding that individuals who want to be on a board, but know that the obligation or the expectation is they'll do the volunteering, and they just don't have time for that. They just don't. It's very, very hard to find people to work on an operating board these days. And so for the health and sanity of your board and your organization, I would strongly encourage you to try moving towards a governing board, and even setting a timeline, like 5 years from now. It can be a long time in the future, but kind of putting it on the agenda as something we're going to move towards, because the current model, I think it's going to really wreak havoc with the dedication of those volunteers that you're relying on today, and they only have so much capacity. And you can always bring in people to help. So if you need a bookkeeper because your board member was doing the books, there's lots of bookkeepers around. If you need someone to help do something in the operation, that can be really useful, to just find somebody to come in and do that task as opposed to a board member doing it. And you often will find that the challenge or the limitation is often that, well, we don't have the money for that. But when you have a board that starts to think more strategically and thinks about how are we going to change things in the future, you actually find that your avenues, the doors open up and the money starts to come. It can be quite a useful technique for changing things. In the key things to get right, and this is for, again, organizations that have directors that are in the operations as well. And this comes to my earlier comment about thinking about things differently in the future, even though we recognize the realities today. Make sure your organization has a really good strategic plan, a good quality strategic plan where you're very open to challenging assumptions about why things are the way they are, and what our role is as an organization, and what our programming is, and what we could do. Don't be afraid to ask tough questions about what could be different in the future, and consider how your governance really needs to evolve or could evolve as your organization changes and grows in the next strategic plan. I'd say every organization that doesn't have a strategic plan really should get one in today's world. I'd say the second thing is make sure if you're following your bylaws that you are following your bylaws and your objects that are outlined in your articles of incorporation. That's the rule book. You got to follow those, and any other obligations like your contracts, and make sure that you know what's in those. And for the articles and bylaws, there are ways to change them, as Marion said. And if they're out of date, as a board, I strongly encourage you to make change and to do what you need to do to change them and update them to current practice. It's just not safe to be able to be saying, well, we don't do it that way anymore. You have to have the rule book match what you're actually doing. You got to change what you're doing or change the rule book. And so both are possible. And the last thing is there's a handful of policies that I would encourage any organization even with zero paid staff to have. So if you have only, actually I forgot one here, and that would be our volunteer management strategy is one. But key policies are risk areas, and I would say budgeting and monitoring, making sure that the organization has a budget every year and that the board is monitoring. So is there a policy in place for that? That there's a code of conduct that speaks to conflict of interest, that the board signs, that volunteers sign, that really outlines the expectations and clarifies some of these areas of confusion. Something called a delegation of authority. It's called different things in different organizations, but it really speaks to who can spend what of our money. And how is that money going to be spent? So, for example, you need board approval, a full board approval for certain things. What can the ED or a key volunteer spend? It's got to be laid out carefully. And there's often even a form that you have to submit to your bank that actually outlines who's got access to the accounts and things like that. But that's not the only part. There really needs to be a policy saying what the board is going to delegate to certain people, what authorities do they have. Again, the financial risk around banking and financial management. So who gets access to the accounts, either to deposit or take away? Definitely need to make sure that's clear and a good policy for that. And purchasing. A lot of organizations get in trouble when there's at least a reputation or a concern that so-and-so's friend is getting contracts and there's a bit of nepotism going on. So have a purchasing policy that you can live with, that's flexible enough, but it's going to protect you and that you follow it. You have to have employment agreements and contracts in place. If you don't have contracts, make sure you have them. And if you have role descriptions where people are playing multiple roles, you can clarify that in a documentation as well. So it's not a huge list, but there's a few things that you can do to kind of clarify that reality and where you can make change in a long-term game plan. I'd encourage you to do that. But I think as volunteers, you are you're greasing the wheels and making things happen. And, your time and energy is always appreciated, but sometimes maybe not verbalized. But let me thank you all for your dedication to the organizations that you serve. And if there's any questions, I know I'm out of time now, but if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you so much. So much incredible knowledge in there. Is there anybody that has a question for Catherine? Somebody did mention in the chat, we will be following up with resources that our guest speakers will share with us, and we'll put a package together for everybody so that you can have it, okay? Thank you so much for that. That's awesome. We are going to invite to speak next Miss Deborah Rosati, who I love doing these industry calls because I get to make new friends like Catherine and I. We chatted for over an hour, almost an hour and a half the other day, commiserated. And I also get to lean on all the friends that I've had in my life for a long time. So when I reached out to Deborah, she didn't even hesitate. She just said, "What do you need?" And so I'll let her explain what she does, but please welcome Deborah Rosati.
Thank you, Tara, and thank you, Catherine, I'm smiling because you've got some of my phrases. I'll re-emphasize them when I go through mine. Really great foundational pieces. Would you mind, Tara, driving my slides for me? Okay. So when Tara asked me, I was like, what can I possibly do for this group? You're all experienced doing great work, community service, putting on great festivals and events in Ottawa, which is pretty exciting. I lived in Ottawa for 25 years, so I have a bit of a bias. I've been to a lot of those festivals. My favorite, I think, was Jazz Festival and the Blues Festival. I know those are pretty notable ones, but I know there's many others. So thank you. And I believe Catherine really sent a really good, what should look for, what do you need to consider? So my approach more is I'm not a governance advisor. I'm a serving corporate director. And my passion, if we maybe go to the next slide, is I am basically an entrepreneur, an award-winning entrepreneur. I'm a corporate director and I have 35 plus years. I'm a champion for corporate and good governance. I'm a catalyst for change and I'm a builder of community. And over a decade ago, I founded Women Get on Board as a social purpose company with a bold vision to build a national movement. We really wanted to make sure that there was more diversity and representation on boards and more women in the boardroom. So our mission is to connect, promote, and empower women to serve on corporate boards with confidence and courage. And I know I will look around the screen. There's a lot of men that are allies and are on boards as well. So this is not, I don't want you to think, oh, I'm only going to be talking about it from a female perspective. I'm going to be talking about my approach is going to be more as you, an individual, what I would think of if you're recruiting board members, what are the things they need to be thinking about? So I'll try to layer on top of Catherine's. So I've been serving on boards for 25 plus years. I cut my teeth serving on boards, sold a company in Ottawa as a tech startup. I was a CFO and I did a lot of fundraising, and that was raising capital. And I got invitations to join venture capital firm, which was Terry Matthews. I'm sure some of you know that name in Ottawa. It was his venture fund called Celtic House. And I went inside as a general partner. And one of the roles I had was serving on the portfolio company boards. Back then, there wasn't any governance certifications. Back then, there was a lot of conflicts. Back then, there was a lot of noses in and fingers in at the same time, Catherine. I see you nodding. So, my evolution and my interest in good governance has always been forefront. I've served on probably half a dozen different not-for-profits, about half a dozen public company boards, probably 8 to 10 private company boards. I've been on advisory boards. I've been on advisory councils. So I've seen the good, I've seen the bad, I've seen the ugly. I've learned a lot. So what I would tell myself 25 years ago versus where I am today are a lot of learnings. So let's go to the next slide, Tara. And Kara, just tell me, I can condense this down. Just give me the window. Do you want 15 minutes? What do you think? Because I'm just mindful of time.
Yeah, you're good for you have 20 minutes till
Okay, well,
4:10. Yeah.
okay, I just want to make sure. So what I really wanted to do, and we just came off of our annual summit, we had a sold out, executives, governance leaders, governance professionals, board members attending in Toronto yesterday, and it was on the future of the boardroom. So a lot of the conversation was, what do you need to be thinking? There's what boards were, and Catherine, you were really evolving. This is evolution, and this is what you should be thinking about. So the concept for boards is that it has professionalized. And, I would see a lot of women and men in transition as executives. So they have opportunity to serve on boards. And I always say you have a board portfolio. Your board portfolio can have some not-for-profit. And the term that was being used yesterday is social profit. So I'm going to use that word because it's a broader word. And we had a great keynote speaker, Jolene Livingston, talk about social profits, okay? And it's broader in the thinking. But at any rate, there's a lot of corporate directors, a lot of board members have governance certification. And so if you look behind my names, I have my ICD.D, which means I'm a certified corporate director through the Institute of Corporate Directors. I have my GCB.D, that is an ESG global certification. I have my climate change. Now, did I do those because they were going to get me on a board? No, I did that because you have fiduciary duties, as Catherine said, and you've got to be learning. And through yesterday's sessions, every session was whether it was cybersecurity, whether it was board transformation, whether it was AI, whether it was climate change, whatever risk boards were facing, is you've got to be learning. You can't say, I only know this. You have a fiduciary duty. And one thing that I always say is, when it comes to financials, yes, I have financial expertise. I'm an FCPA, I'm a CPA, but you cannot delegate your fiduciary responsibility to anyone else on the board. So you have to become financially literate and you have to understand financials. That's like table stakes. And if you're going on and you don't understand it, then you're not taking your responsibility or liabilities in the way because you're not fulfilling your duty. So professionalization has really evolved. There's this whole world of disinformation and misinformation going on, and how do you sort through that? We'll talk about, then there's these 5 Ps of directors' accountability, and it has to do with, we've got profit, we have the planet, we have purpose, we have process, and I know I'm missing one right now, but the whole thing is not just about profit or not. It is, you've got to look at the planet. And Catherine, you talked about fiduciary duty in the best interests of the organization, in the best interests of all stakeholders. You can't just have one lens on it. And a lot of not-for-profits, we'll call social profits, have government funding. And so there's the accountability that you have to be responsible to your donors. You have to be responsible to your stewards, to your government agencies and whoever they are. And that is accountability and that is stewardship. The demands of boards, Catherine, you talked about during COVID and pandemic, the shift, there was a sea shift. First of all, we had to do meetings virtually. All of a sudden, funding dried up, ability to do events dried up. Like I know I went through for my company, we went from doing things in person to, oh my God, how are you going to exist? What does it look like? So that whole transition and that transformation had to happen, whether it was corporate or social profit organizations. Diversity requirements. We don't show up on the board and say, hey, I'm the diversity candidate. I'm diverse. I'm going to have this diverse voice. Diversity of thought is so important for boards, okay? Diversity of thought, be it age, demographic, could be geographic, could be culture, could be different industries, could be different knowledges. That diversity of thought is so, so important for boards to be able to make informed decisions. And then, Catherine, you are music to my ears. I talk about 4 lines of sight and oversight. So people just think of the board's responsibility as having an oversight. And I said, you've got hindsight, foresight, and insight. And I talk about that as well. So it was so nice when you were using that because I'm like, I talk about it. And I'll give you an example of one where, so in the case of, and you can't come into boards and say, I'm only going to have my oversight hat on today. You can't do that. They're integrated and they have to work together. So an example, financial statements are typically hindsight. You're going back to previous quarters, previous years, you're reviewing them. But as you are looking forward into the strategic plan and the operating plan, you can ask questions like, oh, by the way, I noticed in the financial statements, the notes to the financial statement, there was some disclosure on economic independence. There could be a note, whatever it might be. That will draw upon discussion to say, well, I see that, but what's the impact going forward, right? So you're sort of taking hindsight information that was there, but using it to look ahead, to inform you, to look at the foresight. So I always say that they're interweaved. Yes, you're gonna see things from hindsight, but you're also going to be forward looking. You're going to look at industry trends. You're going to be looking at competitors. You're going to be looking at a whole bunch of information. And then there's the terms VUCA and BANI. And VUCA is all about volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And we're all facing that every day. Whether you have government funding, whether, the uncertainty of putting an event in Ottawa, and guess what? It's freezing cold in the summer, or there's a huge rainstorm, or like there's always going to be uncertainty in anything you do. So you have to be agile as board members, as executives. BANI is basically, it's brittle, it's agile, it's non-comprehensible. At the end of the day, nothing is straightforward. Just because we did it last year does not mean we're doing, and Catherine, you alluded to that, doesn't mean we're going to do the same thing next year, right? You have to be agile. You have to understand, okay, guess what? Now we're in a war. Gas prices are up. How does that impact our costing structures? How does that impact, our ability to put on events if that's what your organization does. Then there's generative AI, right? What are we doing? How are we using it? What are the guardrails around it? How can we trust it? And then there's a term that I always use is that we are stewards of the future. And it's not my term. It comes from Hella Bank-Jurgensen. She wrote a book on the stewards of the future. I did take her program, which was the Global Governance Certification. ESG, and we are stewards of the future. When you come into, whether it's a corporate board or a social profit board, we are stewards. So it's evolving. It's not just one stakeholder, it's a multitude of stakeholders. It's just not showing up, and this is what we did last year. It's evolving. So you just have to be current and you have to be learning. And so kudos to you, Tara, to you and your organization for putting on these learning sessions, because showing up and having that curiosity, they always say as a director, you have to have curiosity and you have to have courage, right? And so all of you are showing up with curiosity today, and I'm sure you have courage to lead because you wouldn't be leading in your role. So just context, let's move forward. So I put together, because a lot of people say, well, I don't know if I'm board ready. And you know what? Everyone's definition of board ready is different. So I sort of put together, and then Tara, I trust you'll be sending these slides. In it, we have e-guides, and you can link to those e-guides. So this Are You Board Ready is in these 10 questions I'm going to go through. So, and some of them overlap with you, Catherine, but I'll just reinforce them or I might give examples. So next slide, please. So the first question I get asked is, when am I ready to go into a board, whether it's a social profit, a crown corporation, a private company, a public, there's a certain concept of mastery that you've got 10 years of plus of some knowledge in your industry, an area of technical expertise, because you're coming in with a knowledge, right? And so there's an expectation, and depending on how young your demographic, and you can have one or two that might be maybe not quite 10 plus 15 years, but you want people that are experienced on your board. I was on the board of an arts and culture board. It was the National Ballet School, and it had two kind of individuals on that board because it was a heavy fundraising board. And so that's something, and I don't know in the organizations that you all serve, if you have not only, board members have their time commitment, if there's financial commitment. And I was on the board of the National Ballet School board. So I was bringing governance and financial expertise. I love dance, so I brought my interest there, but also there was a financial commitment. So not only was I going to give my time, I was going to give money. Not only was I going to give time and give money, I was going to get other people's money. And so if you don't give, in that particular case, if I wasn't giving and I wasn't getting, I was getting off, right? And so I always say to people, be very clear if it isn't a social profit company, is there a financial commitment that you have? And so there's an e-guide we have on the 5 common myths about serving on a board. Do you have to be a CEO? Do you have to be a former CFO? Like, what are some of the things? Do you have to have a governance certification? So those are just there for reference. So there has to be some level of mastery that you bring. There has to be some knowledge base, because when I was on this board, the National Ballet School, there was 2 types of people. There were individuals that were more corporate with governance, and then there were people that were parents of the ballet dancers, right? These students. And they didn't have any governance knowledge, and they weren't training them in governance knowledge. And I can tell you, as a person who had governance, it was frustrating sometimes because it would just slow down the decisions, or you would have to go. And I'm not saying that everybody has to have a level of expertise in governance. But Catherine, if you know the bylaws, know your fiduciaries and all that, then you're coming in with a baseline, right? And it's going to be hard to attract. And I know the session going on is about attracting talent. It's going to be really hard, because when you're trying to attract people to volunteer boards, it's their time, it's their reputation. And operationally, and I can tell you, I have on many occasions been asked to be a treasurer of a social profit organization. And what that meant was code to be the bookkeeper. And I said, thank you very much. I'm not here to be your bookkeeper, because guess what? I can't have a fiduciary responsibility and an oversight role if I'm going into the weeds. I'm happy to help you find an accountant, a bookkeeper. I will form a audit committee or a finance committee. Like, I was very clear, I was not going down into that operational role. And I'm very clear to anyone that is looking to do it. You cannot serve both roles. And Catherine, you talked about it. If you need a bookkeeper, don't rely on your board members for that. That is not their role at all. So let's go to the next one. This may not be and Tara and Catherine and others, you can speak to it, but there is a level of time commitment. There's being in the board meetings, there's going to events, there's preparing for the board meetings, there's issues that happen between the board meetings, beyond the corporate calendar, like all of a sudden, immediate departure of the CEO, boom, or the executive director. There's usually a committee that gets put in place. Or guess what? There was some fraudulent activity, or there was a cybersecurity breach. These are things that are crisis sometimes. And guess what? Your hours that you thought you were contributing have now been magnified, because usually there's a special committee that's formed. So make sure, and I use this as a reference for corporate boards, but for social profit boards, sometimes it can be intense. I was the chair of a audit finance committee for the National Ballet School, and we had to recruit a new CFO. And I leaned in as much as I could because we were in the year-end period. So I leaned in where I could, but I was not there to be the accountant. And I helped work with the ED to find a CFO. So sometimes you lean in where you have a knowledge base or you have a network. But if it becomes the norm that you're doing that, I think you need to step back. And I also say, when you join a social profit board, have an exit strategy as a board member. What I mean by that is, so when I left the board of the National Ballet School, I had a successor to take over as chair of the audit and finance committee. I had a 3-year term and it was renewable, but by then I had already gone through the CFO leadership. We had gone through some major transformation. The government cut off funding. We had to find other sources. So I had in the 3-year tenure that I was there, it went through a lot. So I just said, thank you very much. I've got a successor. I'm starting my own company. I just don't have the time. So I think don't ever feel compelled. They're going to be having terms for board members is really important, and have that succession in place. So if you are that board member or you are the executive, you want to be mindful of your board's time, and you want to make sure you've got a succession plan for your board members. Next slide. Oh, yeah, next slide, please.
Oh, are you skipping three?
Next slide. No, you're good.
Okay.
You're good. I'm like, why is she not making it? Because she's there.
I was paying attention and I was like, oh, we're perfectly in rhythm.
You are exactly where you need to be. Thank you. So for anyone that you're recruiting from a board perspective, they have to have the support of their board or their senior executive. A lot of the financial services, accounting firms, law firms are conflicted to serve on corporate boards because it's a conflict. And Catherine, Deloitte is a very good friend of mine and know a lot of your former probably partners.
We've met before.
Okay, so there you go. You're conflicted. You cannot go on, but at the same time, you can't just go serve on any social profit board. You need to get approval. So for any of your board members that you're recruiting, you need to make sure that they have support from either their board or their senior management to go on a social profit or a not-for-profit board. And I have this guy, I do have it two ways. I have benefits of serving on a corporate board, but it's exactly the same benefits of serving on a not-for-profit. And they talk about the benefits that you get when you serve on a board for a not-for-profit. So leadership development, going outside your network, learning about organizations and how they're structured. And so there's a whole benefit to individuals coming on your board, but at the same time, you have a responsibility to make sure you're onboarding them, that they know their bylaws, they know that they know the purpose of the organization. You can't just throw them all the documents and say, here you go to it. So sometimes it's really nice to have an onboarding process if you're bringing someone onto your board. The other approach, sometimes boards have board buddies. They say, oh, we're going to hook you up with one of our longer serving board members. So it's a two-way. You want to recruit people onto a board, but you also have to give them love for it too. You can't just throw documents like, here's our minutes, here's our bylaws, go to it. You want to onboard them, because if they're going to be effective in making decisions and being effective as a board member, they need to understand your organization. They need to understand the challenges and opportunities. And I would always go into any board interview, whether it's a corporate board or social enterprise board, is asking, what are the challenges and opportunities? Like, I can read all your historical, I can read, your annual reports, but I'm more interested in your strategy and where you're going forward, right? Because that's the type of people you should be recruiting. If you're going to be going through major transformation, who has that experience? And maybe your current board members don't, and maybe you need to bring on different skills and competency. Next slide, please. And I briefly talked about, do you need a governance certification program? There is no shortage of them. And Catherine, you talked about your leapfrog. So I would say I took a 2-day program that ICD, actually I was living in Ottawa at the time, that ICD did on governance essentials for not-for-profits, right? It was a great 2-day program. I know Capacity Canada does programs. And so I don't know what kind of training budget your organizations have or not, but there's a lot of really good programs out there, because you do not want to spend your time as an executive director training your board members on good governance. And Catherine, I know that's where you come in. Yeah, and there's a whole myriad of different programs in education, but if you're going to have your fiduciary responsibility, duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience, you also have to have responsibility for yourself to continue to learn and understand what the key issues are that are emerging, as a director. Next slide, please. You're doing a great job, Tara. And then the question I asked is, so sometimes there's a transition. I can tell you, my first not-for-profit, I had a big faux pas, and I'll tell you the story. You'll love the story. Okay, I have financial expertise. I should be reading. I was asked to join the Board of Junior Achievement Ottawa chapter. This was early 2000. And I was so keen. It was going to be my first not-for-profit. I'm like, I'm in, my friends are there. It's a good cause. What do I need to do? Sign up. Okay. I did not read the financial statements. And within 9 months, that chapter was about to go bankrupt. And I tell you, it is so, so important for any director, any board member. You need to be reading the financial statements. You need to understand the viability of that organization. The positive, it ended up merging with another junior achievement chapter. But I tell you that for a lesson. If people aren't reading your financial statements, you will ask the question. And if they're not, I don't know if they're that serious. They're not doing their due diligence. They should. You should be making sure that they have it. Have you got the financials? Have you reviewed our financials? Really, technically, you shouldn't be asking that. They should be asking you. But I'm just saying it is really important. Next question. And then when you get on a board, I say it's team play. You're not there as an individual. If you're used to making decisions on your own, maybe board service is not for you, because it's a dynamic, you're making decisions together as a collective. So you need to have courage, curiosity, collaboration, without a doubt, strategic insights, foresights, business acumen, and judgment rules. Judgment is you're making a decision at that time based on everything that you know. So funny enough, Catherine, right out of Deloitte, the 6 signature traits of inclusive leadership. So just letting you know that it's not a one and done. You're not there to make decisions on your own. And sometimes it can be challenging with other board members to come to some consensus, because at the end of the day, you have to. And I can tell you, they always say, battles are fought in the boardroom, but when you come out, you're united. Whatever that final decision was, you are united. You've made that decision. You might have been dissenting on that decision, but you're united when you go out. And at the end of the day, I have stepped away from boards because I did not feel comfortable with the final decision. I'm not saying that's what you show up doing, but sometimes you just can't live with that. Let's go to the next question. And I know we're coming up to time. And I'm not going to spend any time on this because, Catherine, you did a phenomenal job of talking about your roles, responsibilities, your liabilities. The one thing I will say, liability. You cannot say that. So liability is a big issue for any board. And I would ask, do they have D&O insurance? And if they don't, and if individuals in this group don't have D&O insurance, I certainly would make sure you're having it, because you as a director or an officer of that organization would have liability issues, and you want to make sure that you've got some form of D&O insurance. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not here to talk about that, but I'm just making you aware of it. Let's go to question 8. And Catherine, I smile here because I say boards have that oversight role. They oversee the day-to-day operations. It's management's job to do the day-to-day. I talk about that nose in, fingers out. So I was smiling. Have we seen each other's slides before? But just to reemphasize that, you need to know, and as an executive director, if your board member is getting into the weeds, you need to say, hey, dude, or dudette, whichever you want to call them, you need to back away. This is my job, okay? Because that can cause real dissension. And I can tell you, when I was a former CFO, my first board role, one of the things was I wanted to do the CFO's job. And I actually had a board assessment that came back to me and said, stay out of that lane, right? Because you're used to being an executive and you now go into this oversight role. So there is a transition, and we'll go to the next one. And we've got one more. Again, we talked about financial acumen. You do need to read and understand financial statements. There's some good links in this article that I wrote, and there's CPA Canada has some really good reference materials. It's in the link there on understanding financials for not-for-profit. And then the last I would end up with, what kind of competencies and capabilities do you need on the board? Do you need someone with risk management, global markets, M&A, cybersecurity, digital, ESG, financial expertise, governance expertise? What is it that you need? Because it's always going to be changing. You don't look back, you only look forward to where the organization is going. So I don't know if I have time for questions, Tara.
Actually, that's a perfect segue to what Sam's going to bring us today. So, if anybody has a burning question specific for Deborah, please raise your hand or just unmute yourself or raise your hand so we can unmute you and jump in. Or if you guys think of something, pop it in the chat. And both Catherine and Deborah can interact with you in the chat and answer your questions. All of the slides that you've seen here today, we will send to you after this call, and we'll also put into our resource hub on our website. Thank you. Thank you, Deborah. I feel like we have like the superpower team of women talk about this. We could talk about this for a whole afternoon. Okay, so now we'd like to invite Sam Laprade, who is also a dear friend of mine, and we work together in many capacities in the city, and you will often see her around the city doing many, many things. And she is really, really good at talent recruitment and people. And how do you go find the people? So if we're dovetailing off what Deborah just showed us, it's like, how do you go find the talent that you need for your board? So I'll let Sam take it from here. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Tara. It's always great to be with you and others. I enjoyed the conversation I heard so far, and I've got a couple of different perspectives, but we'll see where we land today. So this is about building your dream board, finding those great opportunities to connect with people in the community. I always like to think about it as finding doers, not those resume patters. So you want to find people that actually want to do the work as board members. So a few things to look out for is obviously those red flags to avoid. Once they just attend meetings, but they never follow through. Talked about networks, but they never really make those introductions. So you're looking for people that are going to be people that are doers. And board tenure, like we find people who want to put it on LinkedIn or they want it for their resume, but we want people that have got that experience. But I also like to mentor young people in these roles as well. Many of them, we find people, if they're not sort of look at the other board work they've done, or they, and speak to the people in the community, are they missing meetings, that kind of thing. Passive agreement, but with no critical thinking, people just kind of go and just put their hand up. We're looking for people that are really engaged, and attracting people that are not engaged with the mission will do your mission no good. This is not, we want people that are passionate about the work. We don't want people, and I loved hearing Deborah, we want people that want to review those financial statements and documentation prior to meetings. So these are all things that in that process of bringing people on board, these are some red flags to think about. And also in the questions that we ask board members when they're going through that application process. And I really believe in an application process, that this isn't just, Tom puts his hand up and all of a sudden he's on the board. We have to have that really strong process around bringing board members on board. We want people that complete those tasks, are proactive, connected to resources, and they connect you to resources. We want people, I always like that term about, asking those hard questions and driving accountability. This is about also keeping the board accountable. So this isn't just about staff or the executive director. When there's a challenge, looking for people that bring solutions, not just the challenge. We want people that are ambassadors to the community and in the organization, and they want to continue to learn, because this is ever evolving. Things are shifting and changing all the time. So we want to make sure that people as well are always looking at having that healthy culture for your organization. So I always like to think about looking at things in unconventional places and people in unconventional places. And, I understand sort of that nuance that we want to have people that know what they're doing. I also believe a lot in mentoring young people and bringing those emerging leaders and having a role or two on the board. not everybody, but certainly encouraging people. You can find them in lots of different ways. We have this beautiful 40 under 40 program here in Ottawa. So I've certainly found many people there that are eager to give back and hungry to learn. They want to be part of it. And then you see them, 5 years down the road, and they're also looking at, and they're also on another board and looking at leadership positions. People that are focused on the community and bring that authenticity, and it may be somebody in your community that you maybe wouldn't think about as a board member. And of course, we want, the lawyers, and we want financial experts, and we want HR people, and we want all of those people. But I think as well, to have that diversity of opinion, it's great to also include some community members so we can look in unconventional places for them as well. And honestly, I find going to things like, whether it be the mayor's breakfast or going to the Ottawa Board of Trade or going to a festival, finding people in the community that you can look to. I've also had a lot of success. A lot of people think, oh, I want the CEO or I want the executive director of an organization. And I'll be honest, some of the 2ICs that I've worked with have been some of the most rewarding people to put into board positions because they are also eager with their career. They want to get ahead. They're eager to give back through the community role. And sometimes this has happened a couple of times where a board member is right there and you don't even notice them. They're someone that's around your organization. They've been volunteering in a different way. They know your organization really well. They bring a different mindset. So some of your most committed volunteers are potentially your next board member. So they could be board ready. So especially when we're thinking about the Ottawa Festivals Network, we think about the creative sector, bringing people in that have that different perspective, and it's an opportunity as well to use those creative minds to tell the story of the board, to tell the story of the organization. One of the biggest challenges I have, and it actually just happened this week, where I had a board chair that was going to be going to a big event, and they said, I don't know what to say about my organization. And they've been the board chair for 18 months. So creating that, that story and allowing board members to sort of share that amongst themselves as well is a really important piece. So look to the creative sector. There's a lot of really, really great people there as well. And look to other boards, see who's coming off other boards, look to other sectors. A lot of that can be a fresh way to see your board as well. We see this often where people really like board work and they are passionate, about something maybe in the private sector, but they really want to give their heart and soul to something they believe in the non-for-profit or the charity sector. So that's something to think about in terms of looking to other boards and sectors. And I don't know if this has been mentioned, I'm sure it has, but creating that skills matrix. And I use this a lot in terms of just finding out where those gaps are. And I don't know about you, but just putting it down on paper and seeing what people bring. It's also a great way, and this has happened to me as well, where you don't realize that one of your board members has a skill set, because they might be the finance director somewhere, but then you realize or you find out that they've got a social skills background. They took something in school that you didn't know about. So this is also a great way to sort of find people that you have, and it allows you before you're recruiting to find out what's needed, because we don't want people to all be exactly the same on the board. We want that diversity of thinking, etc. So here's just a few examples, obviously, in terms of what you may be looking for in terms of skill sets, but you may be lacking in certain areas. But it also allows you to keep this up. I always suggest to the boards that I work with that they review these kinds of things on an annual basis. Even if they don't have a new board member coming up, with the terms sort of work on the opposite year, then you do look at this matrix, and you're always looking in the future for who could be a great board member. And I always suggest as well that people, if there's a fundraising committee or if there's a certain committee, you can bring them on the committee, see how they do in that committee work, and then you can get an idea of what they're going to be like. And you see those red and green areas we had as we kicked off that really talk about if they're going to be a positive person for this board, or maybe they're going to be a bit of a weight. And you're going to see that through the committee work as well. So you can create that through this skills matrix. I have a very much a fill your own seat in terms of succession planning, but I don't want people to fill the seat with exactly like who they are. This is an opportunity to look in the community and find someone that maybe is a bit of a different skill set than you. Maybe you're in finance and you're looking for someone maybe a bit more creative. So identifying that role, mapping that out, looking at the unique things people bring, and the networks and the functions that they fulfill. This is really interesting, and I cannot tell you how many times in a year I get a call that says our AGM is next Thursday and I'm looking for 3 new board members. And I just want to bring out the tissues. And I'm like, you are about 18 months too late. Ah! So it happens all the time. And so I really do sort of talk to them about fill your own seat. And like Tara said, I'm connected in the community. So I think people think I've just got people, in the back here waiting to be on a board, which isn't true. So we want to make sure that this is an ongoing process. You're always thinking about who would be a great board member, and cultivating that relationship. This is not, we sort of think about it like dating. This isn't getting married right away. This is cultivating. You want to invite them to an event. You want to show them what your work is like. There's the committee work note as well. Have them in the environment. I mean, I worked in a homeless shelter for 10 years. And you would meet a board member or a potential board member, and they'd be like, I'd love to be a board member there. And then you would bring them into the environment, and they would say, it's actually too much for me, or I find it too distressing. So you want to make sure you're bringing people into the environment, and be honest about that time commitment. I heard this earlier as well from, I think it was Deborah, talking about being really honest about what this means. I mean, I was told, it's just an hour a month. It is not an hour a month. And the fundraising commitment as well is really, really key, because really, especially if you're in the nonprofit fundraising or the charitable sector, if it's a culture of philanthropy and you come in and you already have your philanthropy designated, or if you feel like you're giving, 2 of the 3 elements of philanthropy, you're giving time and talent, and you're not prepared to give treasure, then already there is this sort of, conflict, and you haven't even started. We want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So cultivating that relationship and making sure everyone feels really comfortable. And you're going to get a chuckle out of this, but I've done this in every time someone's let me do it, is I encourage people, the boards, to get together with their spouse or with their partner, whether it's around Christmas time or it's a summer thing, and have that build that relationship, not only with the people on your board, but with their significant others. And I'll tell you why, is because you're asking a lot of their partner's time. And sometimes, you're the chair of the board. Oh, you've got another meeting. And so getting that and making it feel more like have a social element to it can be really impactful. And sometimes board chairs have hosted something at their home, something like that, or it's at a restaurant or whatever. But it's just a very good opportunity for board members to get to know each other on a different level. So cultivating that relationship, and this could be an introduction to new board members as well. And making sure that there is that successor, that intentional overlap, and that institutional knowledge. Well, I'm in a situation right now where I'm working with a board, and their past president just decided they don't want to come to any more meetings. They're sort of checked out, they're burnt out. They're not participating anymore, and it's really left the chair in a bit of a pickle, to be honest. Not that they're not capable, but it's more that institutional knowledge. So you really want to find people that are going to see the full term through. And of course, we know things happen. People get sick or people move. We know things like that happen. It's really important to kind of ensure that people feel like that institutional knowledge is preserved. And of course, and I heard this earlier, which I was so happy about, talking about the onboarding and the buddy system. And I think when you're recruiting people, and it's just like anything, it's like whether you get an oil change or you're giving a donation or you're a board member, this is about building the relationship so that you want to go back again and again and again. And if you don't onboard the right way, and if you sort of pass them a big giant binder that's being dusted off, they're not going to be engaged. So there's lots of different tools we can use. This is a great opportunity to do if you don't already have it, you've got a member portal. There's lots of different ways to do that, but onboarding those essentials, of course, you want them to have all of those essentials in terms of the mission, the financials, the strat plan, but it's not just good enough to kind of flop it on someone's desk. It really is important that you have those one-on-one meetings with the chair and the executive director, do those site visits, those clear roles. And you talked a lot about fiduciary duties, etc., and doing those check-ins. How was your first meeting? What could we do better? One of the greatest things that has ever come from a conversation like that was we ended up doing consent agendas, which I don't know about you, but they've come from the heavens for me. A consent agenda, I'm all for it. So, it allows that other talk to happen. And I think the other thing that really came from, this is many, many moons ago, but one of our board members said, "Oh, a board that I used to be on is we would start the meeting either hearing from a donor or hearing from a beneficiary, and those moments set the tone for the meeting. Why are we here?" And it really allows you to kind of get back to and start the meeting on such a positive note. I'm a big fan of a buddy system, pairing a new member with a seasoned board member. This isn't just about friendship. This is about, sometimes there's an awkward question, but it allows that pair to be strategically paired together in order to ensure the board system goes well. Once again, I really believe in mentorship, and I know some people feel like you don't want to bring young people on. I've had probably my life lived 500 times over because I get to see young people sort of take the next step and do great things. I really believe in bringing that on. So creating those relationships, buddying them up for 6 to 12 months. I like 12 months personally. And then it's a great place to ask some questions that maybe feel a bit challenging, or there can be those unwritten norms. And I should have put here, which I really believe that every board should have some sort of, if you're using a lot of acronyms, that you have a legend. Because there's nothing worse than sitting at a board meeting and someone goes, "I don't know about you, but the XYZ and the two keys, the 2C2, and you're like, "What are these people talking about?" You don't have a clue. So it's really important to have a little legend and supply that to your board members so that they understand the acronyms, especially if you're dealing in the social services sector, which we are all acronymed in that sector. And then, of course, sharing any concerns. And making sure you don't lose that board member. It's retaining the board members as well, especially if they're strong, is so key. So you want to make sure you have that feedback opportunity. So recap a bit, just auditing that current board, who are your doers, who are the passengers, asking every board member who will fill your seat, building that matrix, and having that onboarding journey as well, and finding those unconventional places to find your next board member. So lots of ideas there in terms of attracting talent. And the biggest sort of notion, and I was thinking about this as I was driving in today, the best way to attract great board members is to be a great board. And, and I know it sounds very simple, but the word gets around about, "Oh, you don't want to sit on that board. They're not organized," or "You don't want to sit on that board. They don't have a great culture there." So, you want to make sure that at the end of the day, that there is a very good chance that when someone's asked, they will think about it as an honor to join your board. That is the best way that you can attract great boards, is to be a great board and to support a great board and attract great talent. And honestly, and I used to do this presentation. I meant to look it up today. I used to do this presentation called "Make Sure Your Board's Not Boring." Enjoy your board. Have it as yes, there's fiduciary responsibilities. Yes, you need to talk about the uncomfortable stuff, but there's also a really good opportunity to ensure this is a positive step for someone that fundraises a lot. Some of the big surprise legacy gifts in the will are from board members that you never knew, and they're leaving like $1 million to your organization. So if you treat board members well, there's also, you never know what can come of that. So that's something to think about as well, is when you're trying to attract great board members and retain them and find them. The best thing is for them to walk away and think, "Oh, I can't believe my term's up." That's the best way to leave a board. So we have an opportunity there. I'm happy to take any questions if we have time. I know we're running a bit late, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to take those. This is me if you want to touch base. And it truly has been an honor to be with all of you today.
I have a question. What do you suggest for any of executive directors? I'm asking this question. I just want to clarify. This is not a situation that I have with my board. In case any of my board members I thought Emily was on here. I have a great board. They're awesome. Yeah. However, in conversation with some of our members, what would you recommend, or this could be Sam or anybody pipe in, if an executive director is having difficulty with their board or a particular personality in the board, what is the governance mechanism that exists for an ED to address that?
Yeah.
How do they address that?
So from my perspective, you work with your chair first. Now, if it's the chair, which I had a situation where it was the chair at one point, that was very difficult to navigate that. You do go through the chair, and a lot of times, and I'm happy to hear from Catherine and Deborah as well, a lot of times what ends up happening is those situations can be, sometimes it's a situation where a board member is maybe calling a staff member directly. We've had that a number of times, in giving them direction, or they're asking for, I had a really horrible situation where a board member asked one of my junior staff to do up a tax receipt for him that wasn't legitimate. So there's things like that have happened, certainly, and that's just in my tiny little career of 30 years. There's a lot of examples of that kind of thing. Usually it is through your chair. And my only recommendation, and I promise I'll stop talking, is to ensure you write everything down. You keep track of it, because some of these things, unfortunately, can get a bit nasty. But typically, you would work through the chair.
Thanks for that. Do you want to add anything, Catherine and Deborah, to how an ED can, or somebody in the organization, deal with a difficulty on the board?
I fully agree with Sam. The role of the chair, I think, if we had longer time today and governance fundamentals, I would have talked about that. The role of the chair is a really pivotal one, and a lot of organizations just pass the chair hat around, and I really see it as an opportunity that needs development, because the chair is really leading the board. It's that role is responsible really for making sure the board is as effective as possible. And as the board's one and only employee, a paid executive director, really that chair needs to make sure the whole board and the ED relationship is as successful as it needs to be. And if there is a problem, there ideally is a touch point or some kind of relationship between the chair. I like to say friendly but not too friendly relationship between the chair and the ED, so appropriate professional boundaries. But there should be, for example, if there's an in-camera session at a board meeting, that there's a touch point. Oh, listen, Tara, just want to let you know there were a few questions about the financials, and this is what was discussed. I want to give you a heads up, because that, you should talk about that at the next meeting, or send a message to the board. But it could also be something like there's an individual director who's just picking on or asking sort of the questions are a little too operational, or it's getting a little too far. And that chair needs to have a private conversation with that director as a starting point. It's not for a full board conversation. It's like, Sam, appreciate your curiosity and your engagement and all of the positive things, but I'd like to talk to you about how you're phrasing questions, and there could be some development that's needed there. But that chair is really the only one who can do that legitimately. Others may try and step in, and there are other mechanisms. I would say even if there's a governance committee and it becomes a real problem, that becomes a governance problem, and so the board really needs to take a look at that. But your first approach is through the chair, and hopefully that's not where the problem lies.
And so would it be appropriate then for us as a not-for-profit member-based organization that really has advocacy in the forefront, if a member of ours was like, I don't know what to do, I don't know how to approach this, is it acceptable for them to reach out to an organization like ours, I'm just using as an example, to say, hey, I'm looking for some guidance on how to best approach this, and we could maybe put together resource material from the stuff you've provided today, for example, or guide that? Would that be appropriate, an appropriate path?
Well, I mean, I think there's a number of topics you could put resources together on, and it's very helpful as a member, an organization that has institutional members or organizational members that all have a similar structure. You could have common learnings. You could have succession as a topic. You could have board recruitment as a topic. You could have enhancing your board's effectiveness in terms of the culture and the quality of the discussion. You could have a topic on volunteer boards, the operating boards and that reality, and how can you kind of navigate that. And so it is a sensitive topic, but as a service to all of your members, navigating challenges as an ED, and one of the ones that can be on the short list is tough boards. It's a reality. So yeah,
Exactly.
I would say, Deborah, do you think?
Thank you for that. Deborah, did you want to add something to
I
give us
think
some wise words?
I think Sam and Catherine are bang on. What I would say is, the chair's job is very much to be a facilitator. And
Yeah.
sometimes that chair may not be the right chair. So if you did have a nominating corporate governance committee, they would probably take the lead on it and have a private conversation. Of course, these difficult conversations should not happen in the boardroom. They shouldn't be public facing, but they need to be addressed right away, post the board meeting, in advance of the board meeting. I always say board meetings have three components. They have the pre-meeting, the meeting, and the post-meeting. And sometimes there's times where you need to do the pre or the post. So you don't always want to do that. And then there's the in-camera. So there's a lot of different effective ways. But Tara, I think as a member community, kind of being a resource base and sharing with each other, obviously confidentiality, but situational can really benefit everyone.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for hanging in there with us as we go a little over time today. A huge thank you to you, Catherine and Sam and Deborah, for being with us and sharing your wisdom. It's really helpful for our members. I'm already seeing positive comments. So for everybody on the call, we'll follow up with the resources. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you again, ladies. This was really informative.